So, to briefly introduce the Victorian era and its societal aspects, we have the first slide that covers the culture of the era. Starting off, one can clarify the Victorian period to be, as the name suggests, the years in which Queen Victoria reigned. This was 1837 to 1901, and I also included a picture of her in the middle. This era was one of the heights of Great Britain, recognizable through the empire's influence on its surrounding countries, defining culture and etiquette all throughout Europe. Most significant to reflect on is the context of the era. Not only does it begin after the end of the Industrial Revolution, but Queen Victoria also took the throne right after King William IV passed, which I'll talk about a little later why he's so important. Firstly, the Industrial Revolution had heavily impacted the Victorian era due to the relatively new, strict social classes it produced. With the expansion of markets came the expansion of the middle class, a better definition of poverty, and new ideas of the upper class, for example, aristocracy and new money versus old money. That being said, like I said before, a figure that also impacted the Victorian era was King William IV in an interesting way. Queen Victoria had taken the throne right after he died, which is vital because the two were very different in the public eye. Victoria made it a priority to act as a role model for the public, whereas King William was not really seen as a role model, nor did he care to be one. Victoria actively strived to emphasize proper etiquette, especially for women during this time. This consisted of marking sex as taboo, as well as valuing femininity and a woman that was very quiet, reserved, but also intelligent. Moreover, on etiquette, an important text titled Our Deportment, the Manners, Conduct, and Dress of the Most Refined Society thoroughly describes the culture and social expectations of the Victorian era. I also included two pictures from the text on the left and right. The author, John H. Young, consistently displays that values at the time stemmed from Christianity, aspects of which included promoting peace and goodwill. Ultimately, Victorian society stressed being kind to all and valued an honorable reputation. This also allowed those of lower class opportunities to be held at a higher standard, not materialistically, but more morally, socially, and within their own community and their own social class. My final point, romance, connects directly back to Queen Victoria as a role model. As I said before, she completely denounced publicly speaking of anything sexual, which also extended over to romance as well. Now I know this isn't really in the novel because we can see Jane and Rochester alone in a room together multiple times, but at the time that would not have been very socially acceptable. And so Victorian era culture overall is vital to understand when evaluating Jane Eyre, especially Jane as a character. Jane is almost the perfect description and role model that Victoria stressed to promote. After the first handful of chapters where we see Jane has a fiery nature when she's younger, we see her take Helen's words into careful consideration, and she transforms into this English woman that Victoria attempted to promote. Not only is she socially acceptable in the ways that she is modest, morally upright, intelligent, and reserved, but she is also physically described as the typical English woman, being pale and short. She is envisioned by Queen Victoria to be the ideal Victorian woman.
I will be discussing philosophy. So what is philosophy? Well, philosophy is the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence. Philosophy is thinking. Philosophy can be ideals and standards or beliefs that are utilized to explain both behavior and thoughts. There are many philosophers, for example Aristotle, who believes that logic comes from what we see, aka observation. René Descartes, who had a major impact on society, also known as the father of modern philosophy. He brought the idea of rationalism to play, which simply means using reason to receive knowledge. And Ralph Emerson, who criticized religion. In addition, some branches of philosophy include ethics, which addresses what is right and what is wrong. It is a representation of values, logic, which is the study of reasoning, and aesthetics, which regards to beauty. Philosophy in Victorian England can be seen with Victorian ideals. These ideals are based off a code of conduct, and this code of conduct emphasizes this idea of how a proper woman should act. This belief that a respectable and honorable woman must be beautiful, elegant, polite, and sexually restrained. The Victorian values were influenced by both the Queen of the time and by the Church. In addition, Victorian ethics addressed the issue with social class. In relation to the Victorian era and their ethics and values, philosophy can be seen throughout Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre was centered around morality, what is right versus what is wrong. Throughout the novel, The experiences Jane goes through affects both her decisions and morality. Helen is a great example of change in Jane's morality as a result of childhood experiences. Helen teaches Jane forgiveness and kindness. In addition, another example of ethics can be seen when Jane finds out Rochester is married to another woman and refuses to marry him at first because it is seen as adultery, which is ethically wrong during the time. Another example that can be seen is with one of the branches of philosophy, aesthetics, and Jane's near marriage with St. John. John viewed Jane as an ideal wife who could benefit him as a missionary wife. She fit the Victorian ideals of a perfect woman. During that period of time, men looked for respectable women. Looks were not the only impact on marriage, but rather also a woman's behavior. Lastly, another example that correlates with philosophy in Jane Eyre includes the battle of social class. Jane's parents went against the social classes, and because they did so, they were disowned by family and friends. Marriage from someone below your class was frowned upon. In addition, another example of a battle between social class can be seen with Jane and Rochester. Jane fears the marriage with Rochester because of the difference between class. In order for Jane to marry Rochester, she must step past these society expectations. As you can see, philosophy is constantly prevalent throughout Jane Eyre.
Moving on to the origins and spread of Victorian dance, we hone in on the three main types of ballroom dancing, the gallop, the polka, and the waltz. And although these were very popularized in the Victorian era, they really began during the Regency era. We see this in 1690 with the German Landler as the predecessor to the waltz in 1786. So the German Landler featured many active dance moves, it was very lively, and thus a very fun dance. However, in 1786, dance started to change into a more elegant matter. The waltz became much more serious, and the dance partners were placed in close proximity. Although this was very taboo at the time, Soler's opera Una Cosa Rara helped normalize this type of dance by presenting it in a place of entertainment and thus making it more acceptable. Soon enough, the waltz became very popularized and spread throughout the world. So next we have the gallop, or the gallopade, which emerged in 1820. This was a Hungarian country dance, and it wasn't very well known at first, but the Duchess de Berry helped popularize it in Paris, and because of that, it was able to spread all throughout Europe in places like Vienna, Berlin, and London. Going back to the waltz, in 1830, we see the emergence of the Viennese waltz. We see a return to the German Landler style. In this case, the Viennese waltz was also much livelier than the traditional 1786 waltz, and because it required so much more agility than the typical waltz, many more young dancers appealed to it and started using it in their own parties. So this became a very normal waltz to have and was seen all throughout Europe. So in the 1830s, we also see the emergence of the polka. The polka began to emerge in the Bohemian countryside, and since it started in the 1830s, it wasn't as popularized at first because the Viennese waltz had just started to become a very big deal in the 1830s. So it took almost up until the 1840s for the polka to really be popularized, as it was in competition with the Viennese waltz. But once we reached the 1840s, the polka was very popularized up until the 1890s.
Covering the types of dances which were popularized during the Victorian England era, there were three main ballroom dances, characterized by their standard or smooth style rather than the rhythm or Latin style. Beginning with gallop, it is a lively country dance characterized by a gait style of dance, inspired by a horse. A faster, livelier version was created in 1830s called the can-can, created in Paris. The gallop was particularly popular as a final dance in the evening. Moving on, there existed the polka, which is a lively courtship dance of Bohemian folk origin and is characterized by 3 quick steps and a hop. It became an overnight sensation. Additionally, there existed the Viennese waltz, which is the oldest of all ballroom dances The dance is known for its distinctly graceful and constant wide-stepping turns, along with its fast tempo. The Viennese waltz is a rotary dance style where the dancers are constantly turning either towards the leader's right or towards the leader's left. Interestingly enough, standard Viennese balls had a common dress code, which is black tie, meaning the gentlemen had to wear formal black dinner jackets and black trousers and black shoes, while the women were required to wear full-length formal dresses and opera-length gloves. Moreover, there existed two other ballroom dances, which were not as popular as the main ones, but were still included in a lot of social courting dances. The mazurka is a Polish folk dance which involves a circle of couples characterized by stamping feet and clicking heels and traditionally danced to the music of a village band. Furthermore, towards the end of the Victorian era, there existed the tango, which is a South American dance in which two people hold each other closely, walk quickly in one direction, then walk quickly back again. All of these ballroom dances are characterized by the fact that upper class society would host these courting balls or social ballroom dances and show off their outfits and their nobility.
We have 3 videos covering 3 different dance styles discussed in the former slide: the mazurka, the polka, and the Viennese waltz. They will be linked underneath in the description.
You can't talk about the Victorian era without talking about the incredible dress sense of the time. Victorian fashion is quite fascinating in what it communicates about the people wearing the clothes during the time period. Not only were there stark evolutions of what people wore, the garments reflected massively important technological advancements at the time as well. 2 inventions in particular were paramount: the invention of the sewing machine, which improved speed and the quality of sewing dramatically, and the invention of synthetic dyes, which allowed the usage of intense fabric colors, which would feature broadly in the early parts of the Victorian era. Men's Victorian fashion was less exciting than that of the woman, but nonetheless, the elegance was visible in every thread donned by the upper class. The overall trend in style among every class was uniformly similar. The higher you go up the hierarchy, the more expensive and gaudy was the attire. In general, men's early to mid-Victorian clothing was a clash of colors and patterns in daywear. Narrow-leg, high-waist pants were often bold plaids and stripes against a paisley vest and necktie. The more proper gentleman kept his collar simple and his tailcoat tightly fitted. Tall lace-up boots complement the overall slim silhouette. A top hat added height, while a walking cane was both a fine accessory and a weapon. A man could never leave his home without a pair of clean gloves, his pocket watch, or a shirt collar freshly pressed. As you can see, what men wore then is not too far from today's formal wear, albeit the Victorians were much more ornate in comparison to the emphasis on refinement in contemporary formalism. Women's clothes underwent radical changes in the Victorian era. Etiquette was an important factor in the case of Victorian clothing. The dresses worn by women covered their entire body. It was prohibited for a woman to even show her ankles. The corsets during Victorian times restricted the movements of women. If there was ever a time where women were in some parts prisoners of the clothes they wore, the Victorian era directly comes to mind. The damaging effects of patriarchal social structures could be argued through such a lens. Victorian women's fashion was many layers of dresses, skirts, blouses, coats, wraps, petticoats, corsets, jewelry, and accessories worn one after the other. It was an elaborate affair, to say the least. The fashion of the era also evolved from the abundance and embellishment to simple yet elegant expressions of selfhood. Followers of the aesthetic movement of the latter half of the 19th century despised the Industrial Revolution, which inspired the exaggerated fashions and the use of the new synthetic dyes that produced sometimes revolting colors and head-scratching color combinations. These intellectuals, artists, and literature devotees longed for a simpler life, and the clothes reflected the lifestyle. Garments were loose and unstructured, used soft colors created with natural dyes, and were embellished by hand embroidery, featuring motifs drawn from nature. One could say it was generally all a bit excessive, but there was a status quo to uphold that quite few were willing to let go of. And plus, they really did look great.
Hi guys, so I'm going to be talking about the fashion in the Victorian era, which essentially relates to social class. As you guys have read, social class is a recurring theme in Jane Eyre, and it basically depicts what a character can and can't do, and overall how they are seen by others. Focusing more on the Victorian era, class is set to determine how an individual lives their lives. This can be portrayed through the different items of clothes worn in this time period. For example, the lower class were clothes that were made from wool or cotton, more specifically in dark colors because it was made to be cheaper. Also, Victorian housewives would make their children's clothes from scratch since they were taught from a young age how to do so. Moreover, their clothes looked used and very basic, and you would not find any person in this social class wearing anything so-called extravagant. In Jane Eyre, Jane goes from being a nomad in the lower class to a married woman in the higher class after she inherits £20,000 from her uncle. In the beginning of the book, Jane wore clothes that belonged more in the style of the lower class fashion. Then towards the end, she would most likely wear detailed and silky clothing that belonged more in the style of the upper class fashion. Now, for the middle and working class, the Victorians would wear clothes that would be suitable for basically whatever task they had to do. For a woman, a normal outfit would look a lot like a long plain tunic with a long skirt and scarf. This made it easier and more comfortable for them to do housework and run errands. With Victorian men, you would usually find them wearing straight-legged pants with a long, thick shirt and a vest. Lastly, for the upper-class Victorians, women would often wear gloves and have a parasol to carry in order to avoid getting sunburns or tans, since they meant that you worked in the fields and were essentially from the lower class. Normally, women would have a maid dress them up, and whenever they needed help getting all the layering under their skirt on. Upper class men would wear their best clothes with the most detailing along with a top hat, which during this time would symbolize wealth. Rochester from Jane Eyre was in the upper class and had a large fortune, and in Jane Eyre you would usually find him wearing rich quality clothing along with the top hat. Thank you.